In today's video, we'll be looking at an interesting ship, the single most decorated destroyer in American naval history, across nearly 30 years of service. That ship was USS Nicholas, and if ever there were a destroyer that should have been a museum, this ship is up there. She had a long and storied career, and she always brought her crew home as well. But before we get to that, let's start where Nicholas began. In this case, that story begins at the Bath Iron Works shipyard on March 3rd, 1941, when a new destroyer was laid down. This ship would take shape quickly, being launched on February 19th, 1942, and commissioned as USS Nicholas on June 4th, 1942. While the Battle of Midway was raging, Nicholas joined the fleet. As a result, she joined early enough to see a large part of the Pacific War, although it would be a few months before she joined that conflict. As always, sea trials and working up would have to come first. For Nicholas, this saw her off the East Coast until August 1942. She only departed New York City on her way to the Pacific on August 23rd, sailing in the screen of USS Washington through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific. There would be no Hawaiian detours, however. Nicholas went straight for the battle zone, arriving in the South Pacific on September 27th. From here, she would take up duty escorting convoys to Guadalcanal, a fairly typical duty for any destroyer of the day, including Fletcher-class ships like USS Nicholas. These were large destroyers, displacing 2,500 or so tons at their full load. That tonnage allowed them to carry 5 of the legendary 5-inch 38 caliber gun, in 5 single mounts spread along the ship. These were matched by a swarm of 20mm and 40mm guns for anti-aircraft defense. Although Nicholas joined service early enough to start out with a single quad 1.1-inch mount instead. This flawed Chicago piano would be replaced as soon as better equipment became available. The real hitting power, however, came in the torpedoes, consisting of 10 torpedoes and 2 quintuple launchers, both of which were carried amidships, along with depth charge racks on the stern to handle submarines. With a speed of 35 knots, Nicholas could get this firepower where it needed to be. That said, her initial service didn't allow for using that speed. For the remainder of 1942, the destroyer stuck to convoy escorts, both to and from Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Valuable and important service, to be certain, but not one requiring high speed. More useful in this case were the anti-aircraft guns and the depth charges. However, it would also be a bit before those were put to real use either, with a notable exception on October 3rd, 1942. Nicholas was in the process of picking up a downed Marine aviator when a Japanese aircraft attempted to strafe the Marine. Less surprising than it should be. Regardless, Nicholas would fire back at the aircraft. She didn't down the plane, but those marked the first shots fired in anger for USS Nicholas, and they would be far from the last. Either way, Nicholas continued on her escort duty to Guadalcanal, with the odd break, such as firing 1,200 shells ashore to support the Marines. That came on October 22nd, 1942. And then 3 days later, on the 25th, the destroyer scraped up on USS Washington. This caused some light damage to Nicholas, but the battleship wasn't damaged. After this, things were generally quiet until the new year. However, in January 1943, Nicholas would shift roles. She joined the Cactus striking force of destroyers for raiding Japanese positions. This saw Nicholas join the other destroyers in their shore bombardment, including both airfields and Japanese troop concentrations. and continued through the end of the month while the Japanese began their withdrawal from Guadalcanal. Nicholas would help cover Marine landings to try and cut this evacuation off. This took place on February 1st, 1943. While the landing went well enough, Nicholas would be attacked by Japanese aircraft on the way home. 14 Val dive bombers, which landed 2 near misses. Fortunately, this caused only minor damage to Nicholas. Unfortunately, USS de Haven would be sunk. After repairs, Nicholas returned to action. The ship moved past convoy escorts into a more offensive role. Shore bombardment and hunting for enemy shipping took up most of her time, with one particular incident on May 13th in Kula Gulf. This one stood out, not because of a success, but because of an accident. Nicholas had fired so many shells on Japanese positions that her guns were overheating. 720 shells to be specific. This overheating led to a shell lodging in the barrel of her number 3 gun, where it would overheat and detonate, wrecking the gun mount. Fortunately, the crew was aware of the risk and had evacuated the area, so there were no casualties because of this, although the damage was notable enough to require repair work. When that was done, Nicholas returned to her bombardment duty, along with escorting cruisers as well. That role would lead into her next major action, the Battle of Kula Gulf. This took place on July 6th of 1943, and Nicholas would come out without damage of her own. She supported American cruisers as they engaged Japanese destroyers. However, while Nicholas wasn't damaged, the same can't be said for USS Helena. She would be broken in 2 by Japanese torpedoes, leaving much of the crew fighting for survival in the water. Nicholas joined in rescue operations, although these would be interrupted 3 times. The Japanese, having lost Nizuki, were performing their own rescue, or at least attempting to. These conflicting actions saw the destroyers come into conflict with each other. Nicholas would exchange fire with Amagiri. This trading of fire saw Amagiri hit 4 times and forced to withdraw. Nicholas, meanwhile, continued to support USS Radford in picking up Helena's survivors. For her crew's dedication to their duty, Nicholas would earn the Presidential Unit Citation for this action. Things wouldn't calm down after this either. Nicholas would be back in action on July 13th, 1943, the Battle of Columbangara, where Nicholas once more evaded any major damage. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the Allied formation in general. All 3 cruisers suffered torpedo damage, including the New Zealand cruiser Leander, and the destroyer Gwyn would be sunk. Still, for Nicholas, her luck continued to hold, even when she returned to Kula Gulf on July 15th to pick up more survivors from Helena. Those men had made it ashore on Vela La Vela and needed rescue, something the American destroyers performed without issue. After this, things quieted down, for the most part. Nicholas spent the rest of July and early August with little action outside of escort duty. This would change to some extent on August 18th. Nicholas joined 3 other destroyers in patrolling the slot, during which they engaged a formation of 4 Japanese destroyers escorting landing barges. Those ships would make their escape while Nicholas returned to Vela La Vela, where she sank some smaller Japanese ships after firing another 750 rounds, causing her number 1 and number 2 mount to jam, although fortunately without explosions this time. The rest of 1943 after this passed without major incident. Nicholas continued to escort larger warships and perform the odd bombardment. However, by the end of the year, she was in real need of an overhaul, so by December 9th, the destroyer was in Hawaii, where she was awarded her Presidential Unit Citation by Admiral Nimitz himself. he made a rather famous quote during those proceedings. The record of the Nicholas is, in a sense, the record of one entire phase of the Pacific War. After this, Nicholas sailed on to San Francisco for her overhaul. She would remain there into the new year, only departing on February 12, 1944, for what turned out to be a far quieter year in general. The close-in fighting of the Solomons shifted into more typical carrier escort duty, for better or worse, along with covering landing operations as well. This is not to say Nicholas did nothing, of course, just that much of it was fairly standard for a late-war American destroyer. This saw Nicholas return to the South Pacific, where she would cover the landings at Hollandia on April 22, 1944, and then the destroyer bombarded New Ireland in May. This was pretty typical. Nicholas did get a break from the routine, however, in operating as a submarine hunter from late May through early June. After this, it was back to escort duty for the most part, including both carriers and convoys. This duty took the destroyer through the rest of summer 1944 and into fall, with her next major action coming in the battle for Leyte in October 1944. Nicholas would, of course, not be present off Samar. Instead, she helped escort Admiral Oldendorf's formation after the Battle of Surigao Strait, before continuing to escort reinforcement convoys for much of the remainder of the year, with a notable moment of excitement on November 13, 1944. Nicholas would depth charge and sink a Japanese submarine, most likely I-38. The rest of November, for its part, saw Nicholas escorting battleships, during which she helped fend off multiple kamikaze attacks, particularly on November 27th. Several ships were damaged during this, although not Nicholas herself. After a quiet December, Nicholas would join the invasion of Luzon in early January 1945. She would spend much of early 1945 in this general area, be it covering the landings or supporting the fleet. In fact, she would only leave on April 24th of 1945, a short stint in the East Indies, followed by a short overhaul, before Nicholas returned to escort duty, covering the carriers for operations off Okinawa in June 1945. This would prove short-lived, with Nicholas ending out the war, escorting supply shipments to the fast carriers, and then joining their screen properly in August 1945. As the war ended, Admiral Halsey specifically asked for USS Nicholas, USS O'Bannon, and USS Taylor to escort USS Missouri to Tokyo Bay, an honor and a reflection of the service those ships had given throughout the conflict. In Nicholas's case, 16 battle stars in all. Nicholas would be at Missouri's side as she entered Tokyo Bay on August 29th. After this, Nicholas performed Operation Magic Carpet runs before going into reserve in June 1946. She would remain there until the Korean War saw many ships return to service. Nicholas would be one of them, entering back into the fleet on February 19th of 1951, a joint ceremony with her longtime partner O'Bannon. She also received a refit to better serve as an anti-submarine warship, namely better electronics and replacing her number 2 gun mount with a Hedgehog launcher, along with replacing the number 3 and number 4 gun mounts, in this case with twin 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, making Nicholas one of the heavier armed of the Fram conversion Fletchers. This came with a change in designation to DDE 449. Nicholas would spend the Korean War on escort duty in addition to serving on the gun line. This earned the destroyer a further 5 battle stars. For the rest of the 1950s, it was more typical peacetime duty, training and patrol, with the exception in 1954 of supporting the Castle nuclear testing. The 1960s, meanwhile, would mostly be spent on secondary duty. After her Fram 2 overhaul between December 1959 and July 1960, Nicholas had a quiet time, at least until 1965. From 1965 through 1967, she would serve off Vietnam, primarily on patrol duty, but also for gunfire supports like her previous service. This didn't see much in the way of big moments. It did, however, earn Nicholas another 9 battle stars. After 1967, however, Nicholas would round off her service outside of combat. She supported the Apollo program in 1968, for example, and then spent 1969 on training and patrol duty, something that isn't surprising because by this point, Nicholas was the oldest destroyer in the fleet, although by less than a month compared to O'Bannon, something the Navy was very well aware of. On January 30th, 1970, the old workhorse would finally be decommissioned, once more next to USS O'Bannon. Those ships had begun their lives together, and they ended their active service together, with Nicholas scrapped in 1972. USS Nicholas ended her career with no fewer than 30 battle stars between her 3 conflicts, making her the most decorated ship in the United States Navy, at least in terms of battle stars. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.